In 1921, the State Electricity Commission of Victoria began building a town for 5,000 people directly on top of the largest brown coal deposit on Earth. By 1983, the town was gone, not damaged, not abandoned, demolished, house by house, block by block, to reach the coal underneath it. The seam that had been buried beneath Yallourn now feeds a power station that alone generates close to 16% of the electricity in the state of Victoria. That station is scheduled to close in 2028. The mine took 10 years to consume the town that sat above it, and 60 more to finish what it started. This is the story of a town built on the thing that was always going to kill it. The Latrobe Valley sits roughly 125 kilometers southeast of Melbourne, close enough to matter, far enough to be forgotten. Above ground, in the early years of the 20th century, it offered little to distinguish it. Grazing country, scattered timber, a scaffolding of low hills folding toward the coast. Below ground, it offered one of the largest deposits of brown coal on Earth. The two facts had nothing to do with each other. The valley's surface indifference and its subterranean scale were separate inheritances, and for decades, only one of them was noticed. Brown coal is not black coal. Black coal burns hot, travels well, commands a price. Brown coal, lignite, in the older and more clinical term, is a poorer fuel by weight, wetter, softer, less efficient per ton burned. What brown coal lacks in quality, it makes up in quantity and in access. In the Latrobe Valley, it did not run in narrow seams requiring shafts and tunnels and the machinery of deep extraction. It lay close to the surface, in places barely beneath the topsoil, thick enough and shallow enough to be dug from an open pit rather than mined from below. It was, by the arithmetic of energy, unimpressive. By the arithmetic of cost, it was almost absurd. A fuel that poor should not have been that easy to reach. For years, that combination went unexploited. Not ignored exactly. Surveyors and engineers had noted the deposit, had measured it, had filed reports on it. Unused, Victoria, the state that owned this coal outright, ran its industry and lit its cities on coal shipped from New South Wales, black coal dug from someone else's ground and carried south by rail and by sea. Melbourne burned another state's fuel, while a fuel of its own sat under paddocks a few hours from the city. It was the kind of arrangement that persists for a simple reason. Nothing forces it to change. The First World War forced it to change. War disrupts the arrangements that peacetime allows to run on habit, and this arrangement, a state dependent on coal it did not control, carried over distances it did not control, subject to a labor force it did not employ, and was exposed as what it had always been, a liability wearing the shape of convenience. A coal strike during the war years made the exposure concrete. When the trains carrying New South Wales coal stopped, Victoria's lights did not stay lit through sound planning. They stayed lit where they stayed lit, through improvisation. A state that could be dimmed by a rail dispute in another state was not an independent industrial power. It was a tenant. That was the lesson the war left behind. And it was not a lesson about coal alone. It was a lesson about dependence on distant suppliers, on rail lines that could be struck, on decisions made in other places by other interests. Victoria had spent decades sitting on the answer to its own vulnerability. The brown coal had not moved, it had not improved, and it had not needed to. It had simply waited, low-grade and enormous, for the moment when its disadvantages, heavy, wet, poor per ton, would matter less than its overriding advantage. It was Victoria's, and it was close, and no strike 2 states away could touch it. The seam beneath the Latrobe Valley did not care how it was used, or by whom, or for how long. It would sit there for as long as it was left alone, indifferent to the ambitions built on top of it, and to the men who would eventually decide it was time to dig. It had waited through the survey reports, and the war, and the strike. It could wait a little longer. What was coming was not an accident of geology meeting opportunity. The coal was always the point. In 1921, the State Electricity Commission of Victoria was established, and a state that had spent 2 decades importing its power now committed itself to manufacturing power from the ground it stood on. The Commission, the SEC, in the abbreviation that would outlive most of the men who founded it, existed for a single purpose: to build a public electricity industry on the brown coal of the Latrobe Valley. It needed capital, engineering, and land. It also needed someone who could take an enormous, unproven state-scale project and impose order on it before the order collapsed into cost overruns and dead time. Victoria did not choose an electrical engineer to chair the commission. It chose a general. Sir John Monash was a Melbourne engineer by training, and by the end of the First World War, he had become one of the finest commanders the Allied side produced. Commander of the Australian Corps on the Western Front, a man who had run large, complex mechanized operations under conditions that punished poor planning immediately and without appeal. War had taught him to move enormous quantities of men and material toward a fixed objective on a fixed timetable. Peace gave him a different objective and the same discipline. He came to the SEC not as a hobby for a retired soldier, but as a second campaign, and he treated cheap, reliable public electricity the way he had once treated a battle plan, as a civic mission with no acceptable outcome short of success. Monash brought the organizing instinct of a wartime headquarters to a project that had no precedent in Australia. The SEC would need to develop an open-cut mine to reach the coal lying near the surface. It would need a power station to burn that coal and convert it to electricity. It would need a briquette factory, compressing the wet, low-grade coal into a transportable fuel that could be sold beyond the valley itself. 3 enterprises, 1 site, 1 chain of command. Under Monash, they rose together rather than in sequence, the mine feeding the station testing the design, the briquette works extending the coal's reach past the valley's own boundaries. In 1924, the first electricity generated from Yallourn brown coal began flowing to Melbourne. 3 years from founding to current, for a state building an entire industry from a standing start, it was the tempo of a man used to campaigns measured in weeks, not decades. None of it ran itself. A mine, a power station, and a briquette factory required a workforce, and the workforce required somewhere to live that was not yet built because nothing at the site was built because 3 years earlier the site had been paddock and scrub above a coal seam nobody had touched. The valley was remote. Not a suburb of anywhere, not within reach of any existing town large enough to absorb hundreds of new workers and their families. Men could be brought to the coal. They could not be expected to invent housing for themselves once they arrived, and they could not be expected to stay, season after season, in the kind of makeshift construction camp that heavy industry usually left behind it. Rows of huts, dirt streets, no permanence, and no reason to develop any. Monash and the commission he chaired made a decision at that point that a purely engineering mind might not have made. The workforce would not be given a camp, it would be given a town. Monash's brief to the town planner survives in a single instruction, and the instruction tells you almost everything about what kind of town he intended to build. The house blocks, he specified, had to be large enough for a family to keep a horse and a garden, not a house and a yard. A horse and a garden, room enough for a household to be nearly self-sufficient, to live in the country in fact and not merely in name. It was an unusual brief for an industrial employer to write. It was not an unusual brief for a man who had spent 4 years learning what happens to large populations housed without dignity and who now had the authority to prevent it from happening again. The task of turning that brief into streets and lots fell to A.R. Laguerche, the SEC's architect. And Laguerche did not invent a plan from nothing. He drew on a movement already a generation old in England, the Garden City ideal associated with Welwyn Garden City and Letchworth. And behind both of them, the vision of Ebenezer Howard, who had argued that industrial workers need not choose between the wage of the city and the air of the countryside, that a town could be designed to give them both at once. It was an idealists' movement, built on the conviction that the shape of a street and the size of a garden could improve the people who lived along them. Laguerche brought that conviction to a coal town in a valley most Victorians had never seen. What rose on the site was not a company camp, not a barracks town, not a grid of identical huts thrown up to be torn down when the coal ran out. A town. The blocks were laid out at 1,000 square meters apiece. Not urban lots, but allotments, room enough for the horse and the garden Monash had specified from the start. The houses that filled them shared a distinctive red-roofed style, uniform enough to read as a single planned community, individual enough not to feel like a barracks. At the center, a formal square gave the town a civic heart, a place that was not a mine entrance or a factory gate, but simply a square, the kind a town builds when it expects to still be a town in 50 years. A tree-lined thoroughfare, given the name Broadway, ran through the settlement with the shade and the scale of a boulevard designed for people walking, not machinery moving. And around the whole of it, the planners wrapped a green belt of parkland, a buffer between the town and the industry that had summoned it into existence, a line drawn to say that the coal operation was one thing and the town was another. Nothing about the design was accidental, and nothing about it was minimal. A company housing its workforce needs 4 walls and a roof. Laguerche and Monash built a square, a boulevard, a green belt, and garden allotments sized for a horse. Provisions that no mine required and no factory demanded. Provisions that existed only because the people building this town believed the workers living in it deserved a place worth living in for its own sake. It was a civic experiment conducted with public money on the strength of an idea imported from England and refitted for a coalfield nobody had heard of a few years before. Walk Broadway in the years after it was planted, under trees not yet grown to their full height, past a square built for a community still arriving, and you would find no sign that anything about this town was temporary. Every choice in its design argued the opposite. Every garden, plotted at a full 1,000 square meters, argued that this town, unlike the coal beneath it, was built to last. By 1929, Yallourn had a hospital. Country towns 3 times its age were still lobbying for one. By 1936, it had a technical school built to train the sons of the men who ran the plant. By 1939, it had a civic theatre, with a stage and a proper screen, in a valley where the nearest cinema had once meant a drive in the dark. The Commission paid for nearly all of it, not as charity, as policy. 5 banks operated in a town of 5,000 people. Chain stores set up on Broadway alongside the Trades Hall. There were sporting grounds for football and cricket, churches for the denominations that mattered in that decade, a swimming pool, a library. Visitors from Melbourne wrote it up as a model, not a mining camp with houses attached, but a town complete, arrived at by design rather than accretion. Planners cited it, officials toured it. It was, by the measure of the time, one of the best-planned towns in Australia. Walk Broadway on a Saturday evening in the 1950s. The plane trees Monish's engineers planted as saplings now meet overhead. Families walk beneath them toward the theatre or toward nothing in particular. In the unhurried way of a town that has nowhere else to be, veranda lights come on in sequence down the street. Someone is always mowing a nature strip. Rose bushes take a second bloom in the cool valley air. The whole scene has the ordered calm of something that was drawn on paper first and grown into seconds, because it was. The Commission's own publications called it a showpiece, and did not exaggerate. Every institution a town needed, Yallourn seemed to have early. Every institution came with a price attached, and the price was not written down anywhere a resident could read it. Every square meter of Yallourn belonged to the State Electricity Commission, not most of it. All of it. The hospital, the theatre, the trades hall, the house behind its second bloom roses, all of it sat on commission land built with commission money held under commission title. There was no freehold in Yallourn, there was no ordinary local council, elected by ratepayers who owned what they voted on. There was a commission, and there were the people who lived on what the commission allowed them to occupy. A resident of Yallourn did not own his front garden. He leased it, on terms set by the enterprise that employed him, in a town that enterprise had built for its own purposes and could, in principle, unbuild. Victoria had once been a tenant of another state's coal, dependent on New South Wales for the fuel it could not mine fast enough itself. The Commission had been founded to end that tenancy. It had built in the process 5,000 new tenants of its own, men and women who paid rent to the same body that signed their paychecks, who sent their children to a school the Commission funded, who watched a film in a theatre the Commission had built, in houses that belonged, every one of them, to somebody else. Nothing in the arrangement felt urgent in the 1950s. The rent was fair, the town was handsome, the coal was a long way off yet, or seemed to be, but the ownership had been settled in 1921, before the first house went up, and it did not change with the decades. Yallourn was not a town that owned itself and happened to host a mine. It was a mine that had built itself a town and allowed people to live in it. The open cut had never stopped moving. It widened through the 1930s, through the war, through the boom years of the theatre and the technical school. A slow amphitheatre of exposed black-brown earth expanding at the edge of a town that went on planting roses. Not a fixed backdrop. A frontier. Each year it took a little more of the paddocks between the pit and the houses, and each year the distance that remained looked, to anyone who cared to measure it, a little smaller than the year before. Yallourn had been built directly above the seam that justified its existence. That fact had sat quietly under every hospital bed, every school desk, every seat in the civic theatre since 1921. It required no malice to matter. It required only time and demand and an organization willing to do the arithmetic when the moment came. By the 1960s, Victoria's appetite for electricity had outgrown what the original Yallourn plant could feed it. The Commission planned a new station, far larger than the first, to be called Yallourn W. A station of that size needed coal in a volume the existing cut could not supply from its margins alone. The engineers looked at the map. The richest, most accessible extension of the seam lay not beside the town. It lay beneath it. This was not a story of neglect or of a company town left to rot. Yallourn in the 1960s was still trim, still serviced, still the showpiece the brochures had promised. The reversal did not begin in the streets. It began in the ground, in a geological fact that had been true since before the first survey peg went in, and had simply waited its turn. The Commission did not weigh the town against the coal as rivals of equal standing. It weighed them as a ledger. On one side, several thousand houses, a hospital, a theatre, a technical school, decades of civic investment, assets, but depreciating ones, built of brick and weatherboard and destined to age. On the other, millions of tons of brown coal, low in cost to strip, cheap to burn, capable of feeding a power station for years past the lifetime of any building above it. Not a question of loyalty against progress, a question of which asset priced in tons and megawatts, was worth more sitting still. The coal did not need the town. It never had. The town had needed the coal from the first survey in 1921 and had been built on top of it anyway because in that year the distance had looked safe and the future had looked far off. It was no longer far off. By the mid-1960s, the Commission's engineers could state, with the plainness of a balance sheet, that the coal beneath Yallourn's houses was worth more than the houses themselves. Nothing was announced yet. No resident received a letter. But inside the commission, the sum had already been done, and the sum did not favor the town. In 1968, the State Electricity Commission resolved in a meeting its residents did not attend to demolish the town of Yallourn. In 1969, the resolution became public. For a generation, the Commission's own publications had called Yallourn a model built to last, the phrase used without qualification, as if a town assembled from Garden City plans and civic pride could be permanent in a way few things built by human hands are. Children born in the hospital in 1929 were raising children of their own by 1969, in the same streets, under the same plane trees, on the understanding that the town would still be there to raise grandchildren in. That understanding had never been written into anything binding. It had simply never been contradicted, until it was. The announcement did not trigger a fight the town could win, because the terms of any fight had been fixed in 1921 before the first resident arrived. Yallourn had no freehold landholders to organize a resistance around because no one owned freehold land. It had no independent local council to pass a motion against the commission because the commission had never permitted one. The town's civic affairs had been administered by the same body that now proposed to erase it. There was no ratepayer class with legal standing to object, no deed to defend in court, no title anywhere in Yallourn that named a resident as owner of anything more than the furniture inside a commission house. Not a fight the residents lost, a fight they had never been given the standing to enter. The commission owned the land. The commission owned the houses, the hospital, the theatre, the technical school it had built 4 decades earlier as proof of its own good faith. The commission owned, in the fullest sense available under Victorian law, the town of Yallourn, and what a body owns outright it may eventually decide to unmake if the ledger tells it to. Victoria had once been a tenant of New South Wales for its coal. The commission had been built to end that arrangement. It ended it by making tenants of 5,000 people instead, and in 1969 it exercised over those tenants the only right a landlord has ever truly needed, the right to reclaim the land. There was no scandal in it, and no crime. Every lease had been honored, every rent had been collected in good order. The commission had simply built a town on the one piece of ground it could never promise to leave standing, and had waited, for want of any reason not to, until the coal beneath the houses was worth more than the houses, precisely as the arithmetic of 1921 had always made likely, and precisely as no resident walking Broadway under the plane trees had ever been told to expect. A model town, unveiled in 1921 as something built to last, revealed in 1969 in a single administrative announcement to have been provisional the entire time. The people of Yallourn did not receive the 1969 announcement as a rumor to be waited out. They organized. Meetings filled the civic theatre that would, within a decade, no longer exist. Petitions circulated door to door along streets whose names would soon be struck from any map. Residents who had spent their whole lives as tenants of the State Electricity Commission, in houses they had painted, gardens they had dug, schools their children had attended, argued, formally and at length, that the town should be allowed to stand. They had one weapon borrowed from elsewhere. In Sydney, the Builders Labourers Federation had discovered that a union could refuse to demolish what a government wanted demolished, and that the refusal could hold terraces, parkland, whole streetscapes preserved by workers declining to swing the hammer. The tactic had a name by then, the Green Ban. It had saved buildings that owners had already condemned. It arrived in Yallourn as the only real leverage the town had left. The one mechanism by which a resolution written in a boardroom could be made to stop at the boundary of a job site. It stopped nothing. A green ban works by making demolition physically impossible, by removing the labor. But the SEC was not a private developer dependent on any single contractor's goodwill. It was the state's own instrument, with the state's own resources, and it held the land under every house in the town, the freehold under every garden, the title to the theatre, and the hospital, and the 5 banks. There was no owner to pressure, because the commission was the owner. There was no council to appeal to, because the commission was the council. The union tactic that had stopped bulldozers in Sydney met in Yallourn an opponent that did not need anyone's permission to proceed. None of this made the residents naive. They understood, many of them, exactly what they were up against. A body that had built their houses, employed their fathers, collected their rent, and would now, on its own schedule, take the houses back. They fought anyway, not because the arithmetic favored them, but because the alternative was to leave without having said no. That refusal was not nothing. It was simply not enough. The failure was not a failure of will. It was a failure that had been built into the town's foundations in 1921, when Monash's engineers surveyed the blocks and decided the land beneath them would remain permanently the Commission's. Every resident who signed a petition in 1969 was signing as a tenant on land they had never owned, in houses they had never owned, in a town where ownership itself belonged, from the first survey peg to the same body they were now asking to relent. The coal did not need to defeat the campaign. The lease had already settled the outcome, decades before anyone drafted a petition. Yallourn had always been a tenant of the mine. In the end, it was evicted like one. What followed the failure of the campaign was not sudden. It did not resemble a single dramatic erasure so much as a slow and orderly subtraction spread across a decade, executed street by street, according to a schedule the Commission had set and did not revise. Through the 1970s, house by house, Yallourn came apart. Some structures were simply demolished where they stood, reduced in an afternoon to a foundation and a chimney stack and a rectangle of flattened garden. Others were spared that fate in the narrowest sense, jacked up off their stumps, loaded whole onto trucks, and carried out along the highway to be set down again in towns that had not been built for them. Moe took some, Newborough took others, Morwell, Traralgon, Yallourn North. The population did not vanish so much as disperse, redistributed across a valley that had, until then, orbited a single town built for one purpose. Streets were closed as the houses along them emptied, the bitumen left to crack under weeds that no council now had reason to clear. The closures moved in the same unhurried sequence as the demolitions, a street at a time, a block at a time, the town contracting from its edges inward the way a photograph curls from its corners in a fire. The theatre went. The hall where residents had filled seats in 1969 to organize against exactly this outcome stood empty, then stripped, then gone, the site absorbed back into the general clearing. The square went. The civic heart Monash's planners had set at the center of the grid. The space every tree-lined street had been drawn to lead toward disappeared into the same flattened ground as the houses around it. The Broadway went, the wide, deliberate spine of the town, planted decades earlier to give Yallourn the appearance of a place meant to last, came down tree by tree, the avenue that had been the town's proudest claim to permanence, erased, along with the claim itself. The gardens went with them, the 1,000-square-meter plots Monash had specified in his original brief, the horse paddocks and vegetable beds that had made Yallourn a garden town and not a camp, turned over now to survey stakes and haul roads. By 1983, the work was finished. There was no ceremony marking the completion, no final photograph of the last house standing, because there was no longer a subject left to photograph. The demolition crews had done, methodically and without incident, exactly what the 1968 resolution had specified. Where the town had stood, the open cut simply continued its advance, crossing without pause or acknowledgement the ground where a population of 5,000 had once kept gardens, watched films, and organized, in the end, uselessly, to stay. Where the town stood is now mine, not near the mine, not adjacent to it, inside it, absorbed into the largest open-cut brown coal excavation in Australia, the grid of streets and gardens replaced by benches of exposed seam, descending toward machinery that has no record of what it is standing on. The Yallourn W power station rises on the coalfield above what remains of the cut, drawing on that same seam, generating some 1,450 megawatts, supplying close to 16% of the electricity used across the state of Victoria. The station that consumed the town still today lights the cities the town's coal was always meant to serve. Sir John Monash did not see any of it. He died in 1931, 50 years before the demolition crews finished their work. And so the man who specified that every house should sit on a block large enough for a horse and a garden never learned that those gardens would end up beneath a coal seam rather than around a kitchen door. His brief survives only in the plans and in the memories of the people who once tended those 1,000-square-meter plots, plots that are not overgrown, not abandoned, but excavated, removed entirely. The topsoil and the roses and the vegetable rows gone the way the coal beneath them was always going to take them. The town survives elsewhere, in the only form left to it. The Yallourn Association keeps the memory organized, reunions where former residents, now dispersed across Moe and Morwell and Traralgon, and the town that inherited its name without its site, gather to look at photographs of a Broadway that no longer exists, a theatre that no longer exists, a square that is now a working face of an active mine. Yallourn appears in none of those photographs as a place you could drive to. It appears only as a place that was, precisely documented and completely gone, present on no current map of the state that built it. The irony completed itself without needing anyone to point it out. A town built to house the workers who mined the coal was in time mined itself, cleared to release the seam beneath its own foundations, consumed by the very fuel it existed to extract, and now that fuel is ending too. In 2021, the plant's owner announced that Yallourn W will close in 2028. The mine that swallowed the town is itself scheduled to stop. The station will fall silent within a single human lifetime of the demolition that emptied the streets above it. The whole era of brown coal in this valley closing in less time than it took the gardens to grow back from seed the first year the town was planted. Stand now at the edge of the open cut, at the point where survey maps place the center of the old town, where the square once sat and the Broadway once ran north from it between the rows of red-roofed houses. There is no square, there is a drop, terraced and vast. The brown coal exposed in bands the color of wet tobacco, dust rising faintly off machinery, working somewhere below. The seam is still there, dark under the batters, patient the way it was patient for 60 million years before anyone built a town on top of it. It was never under the town by accident. The town was built on top of it because the coal was the reason for building anything there at all. The gardens are gone, the Broadway is gone, the theater is gone, the coal is still there, the pit is still there. The seam runs on, exposed now, into ground that used to be someone's front lawn.